Hello guys, I'm Yusaku here, and today we're going to be talking about some Yu-Gi-Oh! Vrains episode 18, and I gotta say, this episode really made me feel for Akira's character. After everything we got on his backstory here, I could really see him being kind of our character that ends up making a sacrifice play later in this story arc, losing a duel in order to protect one of our main heroes, or something along those lines. Something that Yu-Gi-Oh! Has a tendency to do from time to time, such as in Duel Monsters Season 4, when Yugi sacrificed himself in order for Atem to keep going after they lost the duel against Raphael, or sort of like Quattro and Zexal when the Baryon Onslaughts first started, just to name a couple of examples off the top of my head. But I'm really liking his character a lot more now that I have a much better idea of where he's coming from. I think he's a good person, though a very scarred person, and I think that's something that's very relatable. I think he had to bury a lot of his emotions about his parents, a lot of his stress. He had to stuff it down within him and not actually deal with it so that he could protect Aoi. Basically, what he was saying when he was recounting his story in this episode was that Aoi was all that mattered. She was what kept me going. I'd ignore all my emotions and keep fighting for her, keep my eyes on her the entire time. That way I had something to fight for, something to keep my attention away from that. And I think that's left Akira a bit hollowed out because of all those demons he had to bury in order to focus on the challenges at hand. So with some general thoughts on Akira already, this is a good jumping point into probably the main plot point of this episode, which is going to be where Akira gives us a major flashback explaining the story of what happened to he and Aoi 10 years ago. And this brings up my first point of their parents were killed 10 years ago. We also find out in this episode Yusaku was kidnapped 10 years ago. I think it's very possible their parents' death and Yusaku's kidnapping are somehow intertwined, and that would also serve to explain why Aoi is shown as one of the birds in the intro to the show. We've been given 6 different colors of birds, and 6 kids were shown in that forest scene, so therefore it would make a lot of sense that whoever's lined up with a bird is probably one of those kids, or somehow tied to the incident 10 years ago, since we saw that that all seems to have happened around the same time in our timeline so far. So with that being the case, this would serve to show a way that would explain Aoi being connected to one of those 6 birds without actually being present in the same, prison-ish holding area that Yusaku and I guess what most people are assuming is Kusanagi's brother's been shown in flashbacks in the past. If those are even the same building, regardless, those two have been shown to be held. A lot of people think Revolver's Kusanagi's brother and therefore the person in that cell, and he's tied to a bird. Yusaku's tied to a bird, and this would explain how Aoi may be, without actually having been in the incident, because her parents were killed somehow tied to the incident. So that would connect her and manage to keep the theory going. If not, I'm kind of struggling to see how she's tied to the birds if the birds are still indeed connected to the 6 kids. I have a feeling they are, because that just seems a little too coincidental, but we'll have to wait and see. Regardless, that's very interesting. Was it that the Zaizens were, working on the incident 10 years ago, and then they decided, wait a second, what we're doing here is totally wrong, and they hopped against Soltech, and then Soltech basically set up something to seem like an accident in order to kill them? Was it that they were doing something illegal for Soltech, and then they got caught, and then that caused them to get, hunted down by, a vigilante or something along those lines? We really don't know, but I think they're all possibilities, and I think there's a really good chance that somehow their death is connected to the incident 10 years ago, just because everything on the timeline lines up too well, if that is the case, for it to just be a coincidence, at least in my eyes. So that then brings up the question of, hypothetically speaking, if Akira and Aoi's parents were somehow tied to the incident 10 years ago and were negatively impacted as a result, why is he so keen on preventing Playmaker from getting that information? Now, we get a brief episode preview at the end of each of these episodes, right after the credits of the next episode. It's usually about 20 to 30 seconds. And for this one, we had Akira narrating it, and he talks a bit about how Yusaku could have had this great normal life, having friends, being a normal teenager and everything else, but he insists on hunting down vengeance as a result of the events from 10 years ago. So with that being the case, and the tone that Akira's speaking in there, which is slightly frustrated, it makes me wonder if he really is angry that Yusaku's passing up the opportunity that he always wished he had. He feels like Yusaku doesn't understand the struggle he's getting into because Akira's already lived the struggle of suffering through all kinds of difficulties, whereas Yusaku necessarily hasn't in quite the same way, and Akira, I think, although it comes across very differently, may still be trying to protect him, and in such a way that he's almost forcing Yusaku to live what he believes to be the better life that he was never able to himself. So basically, I don't think Akira thinks Yusaku comprehends the kind of trouble he's going to be getting himself into if he continues to pursue this vengeance. That's the theory I lean more towards. It's also possible that maybe Akira discovered something that indicates that his parents were involved in Soul Tech's things somehow very negatively. Maybe they were assisting in what happened with Yusaku or something along those lines, and then he's fearful that if Playmaker gets a hold of this information, he's going to end up hunting down Akira and Aoi on his quest for revenge, at which rate I don't really blame Akira, because Yusaku's shown that when it comes to this incident, his kind of stoicism and, like, mild edginess turns into a downright rage. Like, if you watch his expression when he and Kusinagi, like, simultaneously said, "You know nothing about me" in the past, it is absolute anger to a full extent. And having that directed at you, and we've already seen how powerful Playmaker is, that could totally destroy Akira and Aoi. So, also, given the fact that we've seen Akira's main motivations for everything since the age of, I believe he said it was 16 in the flashback, has been to protect Aoi, this is also a very possible explanation, is that somehow he's trying to protect Playmaker from seeing this information and then seeking revenge on them. And another much more straightforward explanation is that somehow he believes he'll be able to protect his job using this. Maybe he feels he can condense the information himself, be aware of it, and release it in more of a legal format or something like that, where he can then maybe use, like, the law to protect himself, you know, like, sort of like a pseudo-witness protection type of thing. He witnessed, like, evidence against Soul, and they try to fire him, then legal action's taken, or something along those lines, at which rate, then he's protecting his job, which links back to protecting Aoi because he continues to make income, or something like that. Maybe seeking personal revenge against Soul on his own. Maybe he's developed his own vendetta. Akira does seem rather frustrated in this episode himself. So there are 4 plausible explanations. I also think it's totally possible it's something completely separate from those 4. I mean, this show has had plenty of surprises so far, and we're definitely probably in store for more of them, so this could easily be one of those many surprises. The bigger question, though, becomes is if one of those is indeed the explanation aside from the second one, Yusaku could probably help him in any of those cases, because he's got the AI to hold over Soul Tech's heads. He's got extreme skills as a hacker, he's an extremely powerful duelist, and he's kind of got public support at this point. I mean, a lot of people do view him as a hero in Link Vrains. Granted, I don't know how well that still holds up after a lot of people started to blame him for what happened to Aoi, but if she were to, say, endorse him alongside him being seen as still a hero probably by some as a result of fighting Hanoi and such, the public support those two could formulate against Soul, if Soul is what Akira fears, would be pretty unstoppable. I mean, if a public standpoint is taken on an issue, and it is collectively seen that they are all on one side, it becomes very, very difficult for even a company as powerful as Soul to fight back. So if that's the case, I don't know. It's just a lot to take in, and a lot to kind of sort through to try and figure out where Akira's coming from. It's going to be exciting to see what he means, because I do stand by in one of the 3 explanations that doesn't involve him trying to protect himself from Yusaku. I feel like Yusaku could indeed maybe actually help him. I also feel like Yusaku would be a lot more trustworthy than Soul Technologies would, given how they seem to have definitely covered up something very shady already. What's to say they won't do it again, and what's to say that if Akira is somehow trying to reason with them, that won't end up turning him on his head entirely. To be fair, though, Akira does have a fair amount of experience dealing with some shady people before, given how we were shown one experience of him working with a criminal 10 years ago, and that probably wasn't the only occurrence. Based on the way he was talking about the story, it sounded like he frequently would do, like, hacking work for criminals and such in order to make the money he needed to help Aoi, like the one guy who was threatening to break his arms if he couldn't hack through that one system within 5 minutes. So if you're used to dealing with criminals, he might be able to handle Soul. The problem is Soul's probably got a lot more resources in order to bend and manipulate a situation against him than, say, criminals would if he is indeed going up against Soul. There's a lot up in the air about Akira right now, but I can tell you I do thoroughly believe, much like Yusaku does, that he is indeed a good person, and I think he has good intentions. Whether he's going about them the right way, well, we'll have to wait and see, but I highly doubt Akira's actually suddenly, like, turned into an antagonist. I think there's a lot of good in him, and I think he does stay true to his original objective, which is to protect Aoi, and as a result, I find it very difficult to believe he will end up turning outright evil at any point in this show after everything we received in this episode. Now, after Akira concludes his tales of his past in order to attempt the sympathize with Yusaku and get Yusaku to understand that Akira can sort of understand dealing with a lot of pain himself, Yusaku and Kusinagi simultaneously say the words, "You know nothing about me," and they also make an extremely similar facial expression, which makes me begin to wonder if maybe they have more of a connection than just being really close friends. If you remember in Arc 5, we had the U-Boys. They would have like simultaneous lines together where they would make very similar facial expressions and their eyes would light up. Now, I don't think it's anything quite as extreme as like Zark was in that show, but I'm wondering if maybe, say all the people tied to 10 years ago have like a certain amount of like trigger phrases or something like that connected to them or something like that. Granted, that theory doesn't quite work either because Aoi didn't react and she seems to be tied to 10 years ago if she's connected to a bird. But anyway, it is something there, and I do find it very interesting that they had the exact same reaction facially and orally at the exact same time. And this leads into another major point in that right after that, we see Kusinagi and we see a flashback to the person a lot of us have been assuming is probably his younger brother sitting within a cell. But the fact that Kusinagi is so familiar with what that cell looks like and the person in that cell actually resembles Kusinagi himself a good bit makes me almost wonder if Kusinagi himself was in a cell like that. Maybe his brother was as well, but I wonder if Kusinagi maybe was. And that would also fuel the theory that maybe he has a great understanding of what Playmaker went through because he has these kind of iffy memories at best, but he knows what he went through was a major struggle of his past from 10 years ago. Now, I don't think there's a ton of evidence to support this, but I do find it kind of odd that Kusinagi's familiar with that scene without seeming to know much about 10 years ago if he had never been there himself. And from the impression we're given, the public knows nothing about what happened to Yusaku and possibly the other people who were in wherever Yusaku was. It seems to be just the people who experienced it, being Yusaku. It seems like Revolver was definitely involved based on his reaction in the duel, and now Kusinagi's brother, or even possibly Kusinagi himself, or both of them. And given how the public's knowledge of this incident seems to be basically nothing, I mean, even Kitamura's in shock and totally lost when Akira's telling the story, like little bits of information about what he found out in the database when he actually works at Soul Technologies, which seems to have all the information on what happened 10 years ago. So if he's blank, everybody's probably blank. So I find it very hard to believe that Kusinagi would have that memory, which given the timing of the flashback, it does seem to be a memory of his, if he wasn't somehow there at some point or another. Granted, the evidence for it being his brother is also relatively strong, so you could make a really strong case for either one at this point. It just leaves me very much wondering, who was there, who wasn't there, if it was Kusinagi, is Revolver still his brother, were both of them there? All kinds of questions are raised. Now, it's, as always, very possible this theory is totally ludicrous, so take it with a grain of salt. Now, the last two major points I want to touch upon from this episode are a couple of quotes from Emma. Now, when Akira has the monsters Tindangle Hound and Tindangle Angel on his field, Emma says Hell's Guard Dog protects an angel, referring to Tindangle Hound. Those monsters are like Akira and Aoi. So in this case, she's referring to Hell's Guard Dog as Akira and the angel as Aoi. So Aoi, clearly in this analogy, is going to be the innocent one. But the comparison of Akira to Hell's Guard Dog makes me wonder if this is supposed to be a symbolic hint at what his intentions are at the moment. If he's Hell's Guard Dog, it means his objective in the end is good, but it means he's probably taking kind of a negative way of getting there and probably striking a deal with the quote-unquote devil. So it makes me wonder if his end game, based on this possibly a subtle hint, is going to be to strike some sort of a deal with Soul Technologies to protect himself, to protect the others, to get him to silence themselves, or something like that. Regardless, it's a very dark situation to find himself in if he's going to be playing that route, and if that does play out in that way, I could see it being a case of maybe Akira actually wins this duel against Yusaku, but then his plan totally fails on him to deal with Soul Technologies, and he ends up requiring Yusaku's help. That finds them working together, and that would once more set him up to be in a decent situation to make the sort of sacrifice play of sacrificing himself for the good of our heroes, as I talked about in the beginning of this review. So that's the first quote of Emma's I want to discuss. The second one's going to be, a sibling's bond is unbreakable. What will you do, Playmaker? When she's talking about the angel and Hell's Guard Dog, she's talking about how basically if the guard dog dies, the angel can revive it, and vice versa. Basically, they manage to lean on each other. Now, the fact that she says this at the timing she does, a sibling's bond is unbreakable, what will you do, Playmaker, immediately followed by the words Playmaker when talking about siblings, makes me think of a slightly crazy theory that maybe Emma is somehow Yusaku's older sister. I mean, she suddenly seemed extremely curious about him the more she seemed to know about him. She wanted this information on 10 years ago, which could definitely give her some information as to his true identity if she could figure out the stuff about 10 years ago, and she refers to him as sibling-type manner here. She also referred to him after the duel about something about gazing at the moon, but regardless, the phrase translated to the words, "I love you," and siblings do care for each other. So, the theory, while outlandish, does definitely seem to have some evidence in my eyes. I mean, it would explain why she was so curious about him. She would be wanting to find out if he was her brother. That could also explain why she likes to fly solo so much now, as maybe she was hurt by having lost her brother all of a sudden, and she doesn't want to reveal that to anybody because she feels it makes her vulnerable. That scarring could leave someone wanting to be so strictly independent and not wanting to form heavy relationships with anybody, much like Emma has failed to do thus far in the show, and from our impression of her within any time in recent history. So with all of that evidence, it makes me wonder if maybe she's searching for all of this because she believes, okay, this is my brother, but I need to find out for sure before I do any more searching. It's a totally crazy idea, but it would explain the bond, the curiosity, and everything else which Emma seems to fail to have towards anybody else, at least so far from what we've seen. Now, knowing Emma, it's also very possible, the data is a ploy for money. The words, "I love you" to Yusaku are kind of a respect thing of, hey, you're a good hacker, you're a good duelist, etc. I respect your skills for that, and now I'm going to toyfully flirt with you like I do with a lot of others. That's definitely a case to be made there, and it's probably the more likely of the two, but I'm going to throw out the crazy idea anyway of maybe they are siblings. I think that could be an awesome relationship to watch play out, because I think then the reveal of that could be a really cool moment. Like maybe Yusaku's in trouble, Emma's on the other side, Yusaku says something, and Emma suddenly realizes, okay, yeah, that is my brother, I need to go save him, that's my first priority, or something along those lines. It could set up for some really nice twists is my primary point. Now just for a few closing thoughts on the episode. The first one is that Akira's Tindangle monsters, artwork-wise, remind me a good bit of the cubic monsters that we saw used in the main antagonist of the Dark Side of Dimensions movie. I really don't think there's any connection there, but I just find it interesting that we have like the eyes of Anubis on spherical parts of their bodies, which are oftentimes are at like joints and those types of things. It's just a neat little resemblance. I doubt it really means anything. Moving on from there, then we have the fact that Yusaku ended this episode summoning Firewall Dragon. Now he hasn't had that monster terribly long, but given that he didn't use it against Emma and he didn't use it against the AI duelist, we're kind of given the impression he doesn't like using that card unless he really has to. He will use it when he feels the duel is of absolute relevance, and I think that just reinforces how important this duel is to him. I think it also shows that he's very much caught up in his rage at the moment, because I kind of am starting to get the impression that Firewall also is something he kind of likes to keep on the down low for like a tactical advantage with it. He feels like if he's using it constantly, then people will start figuring out how to counter it. So I don't think he's all necessarily thinking all the way through in this duel so far, especially given the fact that Akira seems to be playing against him pretty well, and given the fact that Akira actually made a playing mistake in my opinion when he used Tindangle Hound to attack Yusaku's like red looking Link monster instead of Decode Talker. Losing Decode Talker on that specific board as a player of the TCG, in my opinion, probably would have cost Yusaku a lot more than the other one. Instead, Akira went for the other monster with lower attack points in order to try and dish out more damage to Yusaku. But anyway, moving on from that about concludes my thoughts on this episode, guys. Be sure to let me know your thoughts, your theories, and everything else in the comments section down below. Why do you think Akira's doing all of this? Is he going to win this duel? Do you trust Akira? Do you like his character? What's Emma going to do? What's Aoi going to do? These are all important questions, and any other ideas you have, please share them. If you enjoyed the video, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe. If not, constructive criticism is always welcome, and as always, have an excellent day.
By the street, is there any dreams that you believe? I'm writing on the street signs all my doubt. Can I ask about the music in your bones? 'Cause all I know is the silence when I'm alone.